do that every time. So the role of overview and scrutiny is to provide independent, critical friend challenge and to work with the council's executive and other public service providers for the benefit of the public. The committee considers submissions from a range of sources and reaches conclusions based on the weight of evidence and not on party political grounds. So if I start this extraordinary meeting, it does have the one topic. So first of all, are there any apologies?
I think we're all here, Chairman, so no.
Thank you. Are there any declarations of interest? No, thank you. Any public questions?
No public questions and no member questions, Chair.
Thank you. So before we dive into the topic, we asked Paul and the officers if they could just give us a presentation, considering the document is a little bit weightier than before. So I've done a short presentation to go through what's in front of us. So Paul, over to you, thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Apologies, I can't be with you tonight. I've not been feeling well over the weekend and I don't want to spread the horrible lurgy that I've got. So I've had to come on to Teams. Just as a very quick introduction, though, the local transport plan is a statutory requirement and the current LTP commenced in 2011 and expires in 2026. A lot has changed since the start of the current LTP in 2011. For example, the population growth in Wokingham has increased by 15% and is predicted to rise to 200,000 people by the end of the next LTP. So there will certainly be a demand on the transport network. The council has declared a climate emergency in 2019 and has committed to doing as much as possible to achieve carbon neutrality by 2030, with local transport accounting for a third of the carbon emissions in the borough. It's important to note, though, that the LTP is a framework document with more details found in supporting complementary transport strategies such as the bus service improvement plan and the local cycle and walking infrastructure plan. However, at a later stage, when funding does become available, those particular schemes will be designed up and developed, showing general arrangement plans for schemes. For example, on an active travel scheme, location of the pedestrian cycle crossings, footway, segregated cycleway and carriageway widths will be shown, and provision of any cycle parking as an example. Finally, there are some very important documents with the report tonight, but two which are quite key, which you need to focus on, I think, is number one, the LTP for draft strategy and action plan. And that's the main document, which is the subject for the consultation. And document 3, or enclosure 3, which is proposed questions for consultation. I'll hand over to officers who are going to give you a presentation. Thank you.
Hi everybody. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Rob Curtis, Transport Planning Team Manager. I can share my screen.
I'm
just curious to know how you want to handle questions on this, because I've actually read the whole thing.
That's not fine. I don't want any questions until they've done their presentation, etc. I'd like the full thing to be presented to us before we take any questions.
Okay, thank you. That's what I wanted to find out. So you're going to take it in sections or something?
I'd like the officers to give their presentation. None of us have had that yet. So without questioning any questions prior to that, I'd like to hear the presentation that's going to be put before us, and then we'll take a decision as to where we go from there.
Thanks. So this is a fairly quick presentation. Paul's already done quite a lot of our job for us, really. In terms of what is a transport plan, as he said, it's a statutory plan. And the new LTP4 will take into account those changes in priorities, as well as our own new local plan and other emerging Wokingham policies and priorities. And it also takes into account regional and national transport policies, as well as those other council policies mentioned already. So one of the reasons that we started this process 2 or 3 years ago now was because DfT funded every authority in the country to complete a new local transport plan because they wanted to change the way things were being done. Back in 2011, when our last LTP was finished, there was a requirement to refresh your LTP every 3 years. And in 2011, that stopped. Guidance became just to keep your LTP relevant and up to date, which I think made a lot of local authorities basically slow down the amount of work they were doing on the LTPs because it was an area that's quite costly, quite a lot of work. But there is new guidance, hopefully still coming. We've been promised a new guidance since they gave us that money around about 2 years ago. We do know that it will be place-based. They want us to have a strong alignment between the LTP and the local plan itself. They want it to be vision-led and more of a high-level document. So looking at the outcomes, local priorities, as opposed to being every individual scheme that we're going to be delivering. Sorry. And the main part, which they added, and which is the part that we haven't really heard anything about from DfT, is the decarbonisation section. So we know that there's going to be quantified carbon reduction document, which would sit alongside the LTP. But that's the area where we've had no guidance at all at the moment. And so we've been a bit stuck in terms of the carbon side of how to write the LTP. So the LTP that we've got at the moment is based on the emerging guidance and it's taken from DfT, who have regular LTP guidance bulletins, which we attend. So we do know a lot about what they're expecting us to do. And we know that they're thinking about assigning future funding based on each local authority's LTP's actual content, how it aligns with their own policies and how we actually go about delivering those. But before we start, it's worth mentioning last week, the plan for drivers, the policy paper was released, and also Network North, which talks about what could be done instead of HS2. It's worth saying at the moment, those are still very early documents. Network North talks about a lot of potential projects, so we don't know exactly what those projects are going to be. But we do know there's a slight change in direction because we've already had the ICE, internal combustion engine vehicles ban, which was going to be in 2030, now moving to 2035. And we know the government is very keen to be more pragmatic, I think, and proportionate and realistic in terms of their approach to reaching net zero. So there's potentially a little bit of a slowing down in that area. So that might affect the guidance. We just don't know yet. The plan for drivers had quite a lot of really useful stuff in it, including things like smart traffic lights, how you could improve parking, have a single app for parking, that kind of thing. So there are some good ideas in there, and it still talks about Active Travel England and the work they do and local buses. But obviously we don't want to be punishing drivers, so we do want to make sure we've got a fair local transport plan. And at the moment, there is potential for us to add some additional measures into this, because obviously this is still at a draft. But we do feel that the current local transport plan still aligns with the direction of the government. And it is more of it's a balanced approach to making more choices available. So just going to the transport policy plan itself. The document pack you've got, as we've all seen, is very large. We have the actual strategy and the action plan, which Paul said is the key document really, and that's very succinct and short. So we've kept it high level in line with the guidance and not gone into too much detail. When we do have an adopted local transport plan, there'll be daughter documents coming out of that. Some of those have already come forward because we've had funding for our local cycling, walking infrastructure plans, we've called the LC WIP, and our local bus service improvement plan, so LBSIP. So we've had to bring those forward ahead of the local transport plan. There's further documents on the way, including an EV strategy, potentially a parking strategy, a safe routes to school strategy. Each of those will have much more detail working on those specific areas. But again, this is at the moment keeping it at a high level in the local transport plan. This next document after the action plan is the sustainability appraisal. This is one of the documents that we have a statutory duty to consult on. So the strategic environmental assessment, the equalities impact assessment, And then lastly, the habitat regulations assessment, which will actually follow later as we get a little bit more detail in terms of what those schemes could look like. But as you'll see from reading this strategic environmental assessment, there's a lot of recommendations in there that don't come in until you actually get to the scheme level, or some of those will be passed on to the local plan team and other teams that are responsible for those areas. Then we've got the draft consultation questions, which is another area which we very much appreciate more feedback on. They're still at an early stage based very much on each section of the draft itself. Then we have the evidence base, which is really more of a background document, which tells you where we got all of our evidence from in order to come to the conclusions which we have in that draft strategy. And then we've got the engagement report, which again was used as part of the evidence base, getting those initial views from people who told us what they felt was most important to them in terms of transport in the borough. So I'll just whiz through these because this is all in the report now. So we've got the place-based approach where we've looked at the different characteristics of, well, breaking the borough down into 4 areas based on how people travel within those areas. And then we've looked at the vision and objectives and how they could be approached. They roughly align with both the guidance and the Transport for the South East transport strategy. So ensuring we've got that national and regional kind of string following through to ensuring we're aligned with both our South East, Transport for the South East and government itself. And that's the same thing, but in a slightly different image. So we're looking to create healthy and safe places, grow the economy and reduce environmental impacts. And then breaking those down into some objectives. We have 50% active travelling towns. I won't read them all, but they're all basically based on either national policy or our work that we've done working throughout, such as net zero carbon emissions, trying to align with the council's own objective of making 2030 as opposed to 2050. And lastly, I won't go through these at all. This is the action plan itself, broken down by area. So you don't need to see that, it's actually in the report. But then we've got the 4 areas. And finally, just in terms of the steps that we need to go through in order to meet adoption, we've had 3 groups working on this project throughout. So we've had a cross-member working group, which have met 3 times, I think, to discuss the plan, how we developed it, talked about the evidence base together, and then built it up from there. And we've made some quite useful changes to the document throughout that process. We've got an officer working group, which has involved officers from across the council. And again, they fed into each of the stages. And we have had additional stakeholder engagement from our neighbours, from other industry experts, including freight representatives, people like the AA and the RAC, Chamber of Commerce. I think were invited, but I don't think they actually came along. But we've tried to involve some of those high level and regional stakeholders that are going to be able to help us put together our LTP. So then we produced our evidence base, had our principles consultation, which isn't necessarily a recommendation from the guidance, but it is something that we wanted to do just to try and get a little bit of a steer in terms of whether we're going in the right direction with our plan. And then obviously based on the evidence of that consultation, we've been able to develop our draft strategy. And then we're now at this stage of scrutiny, which we'll then take to executive for approval to consult with the public. The consultation will be over hopefully December and January, depending on how those processes go. Then we'll be looking to finalise the LTP throughout the spring with approval and adoption by full council in summer 2024. So yeah, sorry, that's slightly longer than I said it would be, but that takes me to the end of the presentation. So, Chair, thank you.
Thank you very much. Is there anything else coming from the floor?
Not for me.
No? Okay. Well, gentlemen, thank you very much for the presentation. If you want to leave, you can. I don't think there's any questions we want to ask you directly because it's all in the questions about the documentation. The presentation was to introduce the document, which I'm very grateful for. It's made it quite easy for me to bring it on board and what I've already read. So unless there are any questions from the floor, Pauline.
I think the first point is that there are questions about the documentation. I think only the officers can answer. So I'd appreciate them staying. I don't know about anybody else.
So you want them to stay for the rest of the evening? Are you covered, gents?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's fine.
So before we start diving in and asking questions, etc., I just want to run through, having reviewed what I think we're looking here to be considering. So why are we here? As a committee to consider the draft LTP4, offer any comments and recommendations where appropriate. We are to base our observations and comments on what is placed before us in this documentation and on the presentation by the officers and the executive at this meeting. This draft plan has implications across the borough and not just specific ward areas. Funding for this plan is core to projects and ambitions, and the only guaranteed source is core funds from SIL and the LTP integrated block. But this council has been very successful in applying for external grant funding, and this draft plan allows the council to take advantage of the opportunities that grant funding enables and will continue to do so. So if I look at page 5, the summary of the report, that is supposed to be it. As far as it looks at, this is a summary of the complete presentation of the LTP4, not all the evidence base that's behind it. So this effectively, agenda 48 item goes through, let's get this right, the page numbers. Open the draft stoppage. 2, 3, 27. Goes through to page 42. That is the draft plan. The rest of it is the detail for the plan, where the evidence came from, how that's to be applied with meeting the requirements of this. And one thing I think we should consider is that this is a draft of a plan that's already been running for some years, since 2011. I think that's the right date. Yeah, 2011 till 2026. We're looking at doing an update for what's remaining of that period. Lots of what was originally planned in the LTP3 and previous renditions has already been achieved. So this is about outstanding items and aims and ambitions that are detailed on page 42. So where do we go on from here? In my view, and I'm going to put this to the floor, we should be looking at page 42 and looking at seeing what is being planned, what the ambitions are for the plan, and commenting on that to say, is this plan actually something that is worth achieving? Do we recommend to present this to the council, to executive and full council? The other items that go within here are the engagement and questionnaire. There's still a public consultation to go ahead, so it's not as if we're going to make the decision and that's the end of it. There's still a public consultation to go ahead. We've still got the results of that to come in as well. So it's whether or not what's in front of us now is usable for that purpose. As a presentation of the initial plan, to supplement the engagement questionnaires, and does that aim to give us the results that we hope and anticipate will be delivered? Not necessarily that certain items are going to be acted, but the whole thing. And the other thing we have to consider, even though there are schemes going on at the moment, and I won't go and quote individual ones because it will upset individual people. There are individual schemes going on that may or may not be your flavour of the month, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to happen, because at the end of the day, it's about the funding and the changes in policy, etc., from the government and other things that are going to affect it. So I'm going to open it to the floor to a certain extent here now and ask, are there anything that you want to comment on about for argument's sake, let's start with the summary. If we look at page on summary on page 4, do you think there's anything in there that's worth going? So Pauline first and then Al.
Thank you. If we're restricting ourselves to the summary up to page 42, the first question is on page 17. You've got on page 17 that the Early Woodley and Shinfield area directs most of its traffic towards Reading. But on page 27 in section 4.1.1, you say only 30% of the traffic is going towards Reading. I just wonder if you'd explain why that apparent contradiction and what I've misunderstood. Can we repeat the numbers again?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, it's page 27. So it's page 17. It says Early Woodley and Shinfield includes most of the urban areas of these towns where travel is largely directed towards Reading. And on page 27, it says areas around Woodley, Earley and Shinfield abut the Reading conurbation. Travel to Reading accounts for nearly a third. That is not my definition of most or largely. It's a third. And I'm just wondering why it contradicts itself.
Sorry, Polly. Sorry, Polly, could you tell me what point that was again on page 27?
Page 27, 4.1.1. Sorry, 4.11, pardon. Helps if you don't have too many spots in your notes. Got other questions on this, but that was the first one.
So without looking at the data, I can't tell you exactly why that is. I do have Steve Bailey on the call. I don't know whether he knows why that is the case.
Hi there. I'm supporting Rob in delivering the local transport plan. I will take that away and I'll check that inconsistency. I'll investigate why there is an apparent discrepancy between the stats quoted within the document. Thank you for highlighting that.
Thank you, Steve. And the second question I had was on page 36. One of the outcomes that I didn't see on the 50% active travel in towns, which I think is quite important, is something to do with the travelling to school. I think there's an issue that a lot of people can't take active travel to school because they can't get into the school that's closest to them. So I think there's potentially a knock-on into school allocation and school locations, and that doesn't seem to be reflected in page 36 in the second half. I think it'd be useful possibly to add that. And on page 37, the one thing, again, it doesn't mention on the environmental impacts is that Winner's Triangle has a pretty rubbish bus service. It's quite difficult to get from Winner's Triangle anywhere after 6 o'clock at night. And I'm just wondering if that's something else we should mention in that page 37. And that was it from me on that first section.
So in terms of the schools comment, in the action plan, we do talk about having a safer routes to schools strategy, which would be one of the documents, and that's exactly the kind of thing that we'd want to appear in there. We could bring it into this higher level as well, potentially. I think that makes sense because it's certainly worth talking about schools in there as well. So something to take back. The other point that you made about Winner's Triangle is possibly a little bit too specific for this kind of level.
The only reason I mentioned it is it talks about high quality cycling facilities between Winner's Triangle and Early Royal Berkshire Hospital and Woodlands Out. So it goes into quite a lot of specifics in there, but it doesn't mention the bus service. And I just thought it might be worth mentioning. You're right, though. I mean, it is a detail.
Thanks. And again, that's well, I think that one's already in the BSIP. I hope it is. So it is in the document. But yeah, again, it is something we could raise. We'll take that back and have a think about it. Thanks.
If I could just come in on that, it is in the BSIP. Also, there is the 4 and the X4 that run during the evenings as well from the London Road, not directly from Winner's Triangle, but there are some points in the BSIP in more detail about Winner's Triangle. That helps. Thank you.
I remember.
Sorry, Al, you had your hand up first, and then Laura.
Sorry, just while we're just doing quibbles, can I just do 2 then? On page 59, Bideford Town Centre, I think they prefer village centre. I don't think they like to be called a town. And on page 216. 6. Yeah, the towns and parishes of WBC. There's 17 parishes, aren't there, in Woking Borough? 3 Mile Cross, Spencerswood aren't parishes, but there's 3 missing, which is Woking Without, Wokingham and Swallowfield. So that's okay.
And so I think someone's used the wrong map there because we do have the map of the towns and parishes, so we'll get that fixed. So. And you're right about Twyford as well. So
Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted some clarity from Councillor Fishwick on page 37 about the cycle facilities. Am I right in thinking I heard you say that we still don't have a definite timeline because we're not quite sure about when we'll get the funding?
That would be correct, Laura. It's all dependent on government funding or external funding, which could come from Section 106 government or via SIL as well if towns and parishes chip in. So we can't have a programme of when something's going to get delivered. We have to bid for it.
Do we know when we'll know the outcome of that bid?
Depends on when bids come up or funding becomes available through Section 106 and development.
Okay, thank you. I've got a separate question, page 42 on the action plan, the 20 mph speed limit in town centres. I wondered what the desired effect, the vision, the approach will be if Twyford is included in there because it's a village, because we've got such different towns. Like Early Town has no town centre, Woodley Town, the precinct is totally pedestrianised. So just a little more about that would be great.
That's absolutely fine. Yeah, so obviously it's a sweeping statement, so it's very hard to go into any detail in individual locations. But we would need to look at each individual location and see if it's appropriate. I think that's what's kind of borne out of what the announcement was last week, really, is we don't want blanket 21 hour just for the sake of it. We need to make sure it's appropriate. And
Thank you, Laura. David, you're next, and then Peter.
Thank you, Chair. 2 points. The first is picking up on Pauline's comment earlier, which I was going to make myself. We're looking at this as a transport plan, and therefore we see all the solutions to our problems being transport orientated, but actually provision of other infrastructure solves that problem. So, for example, Pauline's particular point about schools. I mean, having another secondary school in the south of the borough would save an awful lot of transport coming from Finchampstead and environs across the other side of Wokingham. And I'm sure there are plenty of other examples as well. So in terms of the vision, are we looking at kind of cross-linking ideas into other areas so that the transport plan is not simply reliant upon transport, it's relying upon solutions to people's problems and the reason why they move. And the second point relates to page 42. And I appreciate all those measures there. We could drive ourselves into insanity trying to put sort of smart measures against each of them. But the one that does catch my eye is the question of clean air, because that is on top of everybody's sort of agenda, and it's a large part of the actions here. What are we doing about increasing measurements of air quality to see how this plan might be, what impact this plan is having on that issue?
So sorry, let's go back to your first question. Provision of other infrastructure. We are working very closely with local transport, with the local plan team. So they're obviously very keen to know what our measures are going to be, but we're also talking to them about where their improvements are going to be, and we're discussing things like the location of schools and also the timing of when they open and that kind of thing. I think obviously it's down for the local plan team to explain why things are the way they are, but hands are often tied by developers and that kind of thing. So it's a very difficult balance to achieve, but we are talking to them about that and trying to get that right. Your other question, I've already forgotten. Sorry. Air quality, sorry. So our public protection partnership obviously collects the air quality data and they feed that back to us. At the moment, they're still mainly focused on those air quality management areas. Whether there is going to be any further air quality monitoring, we'll discuss further with them, I think, as we develop the plan to a more, when we're going to have to set ourselves some measurable targets, as you say. So knowing where to put them and where it's going to be relevant. I think I'm not a massive air quality expert, but there is a bit of a shift towards looking at particulate matter as well as NO2, which has traditionally been the main focus. So we're obviously having those discussions with Charlie and the BPP regularly, and we'll keep that going. And when we come to set targets, we'll obviously need to have some more data and make sure we can still collect it as we go forward.
Just to add to what Rob said as well, there's also quite a large number of locations across the borough which have diffusion tubes, which are little tubes which sit upside down, and they collect nitrogen dioxide, and they are measured on a monthly basis, and they are reported through our annual environment report, which is then published by DEFRA under the Environment Act. So any particular location which is then found to be breaking the current criteria, then further measures would be undertaken. And that's where the air quality management areas come from, which also have action plans.
Thank you, Paul. If I can add to that, actually, within the climate emergency, that topic has been presented to us in quite depth. So we are aware of the measurements and where we stand. Dave.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just come back on that. Thanks very much for that answer, particularly on the air quality point. Referring back to my first question, which is increasing the scope of the plan to include other infrastructure. I appreciate that's pretty tough as a question to ask for the highways team, but I think it is a question that we might want to refer up to the overview of the Scrutiny Management Committee and perhaps the exec, because I do think, generally speaking, most of our strategies that we have in all sorts of areas would benefit from a bit more cross-linking at the top level than we always sort of tend to see.
So from our perspective, our sphere of influence is fairly limited in terms of actually delivering that sort of stuff. But in the national policy setting here, the LTP and the local plan are very linked, and one another needs to support. So the strategy, the local transport plan, can set the rule book, if you like, around what we'd like to see in terms of provision to schools, and it's be the local plan that looks at the locations that meet those. So there is a sort of a joined up connection between the two, where they both are mutually consistent with one another. But it's not for us in the local transport plan to decide where the schools go, but what they need to look at when they consider where schools get considered. So that's kind of where it ties into it. And the teamwork is they are part of the working group. So make sure that happens.
Peter.
Oops. There we go. So yeah, nice to see the report. Page 23, section 3.5 and 3.6. It's nice to see the concerns enumerated by the residents who did respond to this. The big concern I have is we have a lot of national press and various observers who are bashing against this type of thing. So I just want to make sure we've got a policy or communication plan to actually bring the residents along with us, because a lot of the action plans are contentious. So, for example, the 20-mile-an-hour stuff, we've seen what's happened in Wales. We've seen the right-wing press jump on that and push back on it. So we need to actually bring residents along with us. So part of the action plan should include a communication, bring residents along with why this is being done type of thing.
Yeah, sorry, thanks for that. Yeah, so we do already do a fair amount of that work through our My Journey team. We've got a fairly recent new marketing campaign, which is about the active swaps and that kind of thing. So it's all about getting people in people's minds that active travel, I suppose, is more kind of mainstream. But it is something that we're still trying to work on more, I think. And we are working with the comms team in terms of, I suppose, initially getting those responses, and the discussion we've had already, I think, in our last meeting about the relatively low level of response that we've had to this consultation. It's trying to get to those hard to reach groups. So we're already talking to comms about how we can approach those groups, and also how we can do things like paid advertising, so through social media and that kind of thing, to get to particular groups, which I know the comms team did recently in a consultation to try and, I think there was a shortage of responses from men and from younger people, so they specifically targeted those through social media. So it is something we want to do, but the feedback from comms on that was, unfortunately, that despite they paid that additional money, they didn't still get a huge increase in the responses in that area. So it's still a challenge, and we're definitely open to any particular ideas in that area.
Okay. I'll drop you some thoughts on that.
Okay.
Next one. You kind of touched on this as well in your presentation. Page 32, 5.19, aligned with national policy. Personally, I don't believe the government are actually aligned with a lot of this with their actions. you mentioned about getting funding based upon government policies, based upon this document. What can be done in case there is no such funding made, i.e. what this document is trying to do is in conflict with what the government is actually doing?
Well, I think the initial answer is we need to change our approach, because that's basically where the money is, because that's what the government wants us to do. And as I mentioned at the start, DfT are looking to actually score boroughs or local transport authorities on what their LTP, how it aligns with their own policies, and also how we go about delivering those. So it's one thing to have the policy, and then just to do nothing for a couple of years isn't going to get anything from DfT. So we are aligned with national policy as much as we are. So that, I think the comment on that on page 32 was about the 50% trips in towns. That's from the current cycle and walking investment strategy, and it's in the decarbonisation strategy as well. So we do have the majority of those. Well, I think they all align with national policy to one extent or another. It's just, I suppose the way things are changing with the announcements last week, we need to be careful in terms of what might change and how that might change our approach. I think that's going to be a very long-term process. So we feel that at the moment we've still got a local transport plan that is valid and still aligns with policy.
Okay, I was kind of looking for, say, okay, we know we've got SIL money coming in and we can actually use that to mitigate any government actions. Sort of.
But yeah, sorry, that's the second part. And as we've already mentioned, local transport, the local plan team, we meet with them every 2 weeks to go through our approach and the work that we're doing and go through some of their work so that we can ensure we're aligned. And one of the areas that we talk about is ensuring that we've got that kind of, I suppose, conveyor belt of schemes almost, that when a developer comes forward and says we want to do some work here, we can say, well, can you we've got plans to do a cycle route here, improve buses here, make a junction improvement here, to minimise and mitigate the impact of traffic. And so that will both deliver our plan and also meet the developers' needs to mitigate traffic from their new developments. So yeah, that's definitely part of it. And a lot of that would be section 106, I think, as well as, still on the horizon. I'm sure what's happening there. But.
Okay, I think really the underlying action there is actually what mitigation do you have within this plan in case we do not get any government funding. So I think that's the underlying action I have there. Yeah. Page 34, you mentions about EVs. I think clear from what you said is EVs are only deal with one part of the problem with clean air. You mentioned particulates, so I think that's fairly enough covered. But I think that needs to be recognised as EV is only part of the solution. It's not the complete solution by any means.
Yeah, sorry, I would agree with that. One of our documents is potentially a low emissions transport strategy, which we'll look at carbon obviously, but also other emissions. So we'll look at other air quality impacts that are caused by all traffic. So obviously trains and buses as well. But yeah, that is a good point. It's not something that we're ignoring, but it's
the point I'm trying to make is bring the community along with us. Be it high like this, and I will say I was not aware of the LTP 3. I didn't know. I don't think any of our residents know about this, so it'd be useful to have get contact with the local paper and just say, look, we're doing this, so people catch to see there's something happening.
Yeah,
as opposed
definitely. That's not only part of what they'll do when we do the consultation, but obviously as we go through the process, it's about continually pushing that message. One thing the comms team tell me is they do put out the press releases on a number of different subjects, but quite often it's up to the press how high they take that up their own agenda. So it's quite often conflicting with other things that are going on, regionally as well as nationally, as to whether they'll make a story out of it or not, I suppose.
Okay, I've got some more questions. Does somebody else want to leap in? Laura, please.
I was just going to add to what Peter was saying about bringing residents with us, because on page 36 it says about considering e-scooter hire schemes, and there are a lot of residents who have a lot of fear and have had lots of bad experiences with e-scooters. So I think if the council does anything, has to be very considerate as to the communications and doing that sensitively, because it's great for accessibility and to be green, but there have also been very serious accidents as well. And in London, they just sort of dump the hire scooters everywhere, which is a major trip hazard and not great. So as Peter said, with various things, bringing people with us is very important.
Yep, no, agreed. And that's a really good point. I think any, all of these measures will need further consultation as they get more and more detailed. But something like e-scooters, we know, is a sensitive subject. So obviously the approach will be slightly different for nursery.
Yeah, I was just going to add as a reminder for everybody that e-scooters are illegal in Wokingham.
Thank you, Paul. David.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to back up these comments being made about communications. I mean, some damage was done on the first consultation I was aware of on the LC whip in the way that sort of plans for cycling from Finchaps into Woking were set out. I mean, the way they were set out, I voted against it myself. And I do wonder whether there's, in terms of the communications as we go forward, whether there's a role for ward members or other members to sort of contribute to this sort of process, just as a sort of bit of a local ear on things. And I don't mean that being parochial in terms of areas, but just in terms of how what we're saying might be interpreted in ways we didn't intend. My other point was on page 34, point 531, with reference to Twyford Station. And I may have made this comment previously, I'm not sure, but I live about as far as it's possible, as far away from Twyford as it's possible to be and still be in the borough. But it's rapidly becoming my station of choice because of the connectivity into London that it provides via the Elizabeth line. And I do wonder whether sufficient regard has been paid to this looking forward in terms of what changes are occurring to people's choice of rail as an option. It certainly is, for me, say we go there now rather than almost any other station. And I'm not the only one that I know of around my way. And that has implications for traffic and access to Twyford town centre and parking at the station. So I just wonder if that has been given as much weight as it might have been.
That's really useful feedback. I think we've all anticipated Twyford becoming much more popular because of the Elizabeth line, and it always has been a useful station, I think, in terms of or even comparing costs to going from Reading and parking. It's definitely a bit of a challenge, but we do have aspirations to have a more frequent bus service there, improved cycling links. We know, obviously, with an increase in electric bikes, people who can cycle could cycle on an electric bike, a much longer distance. So again, trying to make those other options available is a big part of what we want to try and do in order to get people to Twyford without adding to the congestion and the difficulty parking. So those that have to drive can get there and can park. But we do still, I think, acknowledge that there's a capacity problem at Twyford Station. It's obviously Network Rail's gift to do something about that. And we do have discussions with them about what they could do. But I think if they do bring in any additional parking, it will need obviously some very careful planning, and we don't want to be pulling more traffic in through Twyford Crossroads, for instance, without doing other mitigation measures to make sure congestion doesn't get worse and we don't have an increase in collisions, that kind of thing.
Just want to draw attention to page 33, and there's a quite handy little plan of aspirational sustainable travel network, and that actually shows our aspiration for that link from Wokingham town through Winnersh to Twyford Station to increase the frequency of the bus service to Twyford.
Thank you, Paul. Where are we going? Pauline.
Just whilst we're talking about stations, I actually think the Borough Council could do something about Twyford Station access as well. I think there is land around Twyford that could potentially be used for some form of access. So I don't think dumping all the problem on Network Rail is necessarily the only answer, although I can understand why you do it. And the second question was about Winnersh Triangle. I notice in the next section there's a lot of comment about Winnersh, but there isn't very much about Winnersh Triangle. Relatively, do you think more people use Winnersh Triangle than Early? Because my guess is that actually quite a lot of people from the south of Early use Winnersh Triangle rather than Early Station, and you don't really mention it.
I'm pretty sure we do have some data on the entries to each of the stations, and it would be in the evidence base, hopefully, but I can check that. But yeah, it is an interesting point that we haven't mentioned Winnersh Triangle that much, because it is obviously a key station for the businesses as well as residents. So
I was looking at page 55, 56 actually, which I was going to come to later, but I think if we're talking about other stations, you might want to focus on that one as well.
No, yeah, sure, thanks. And sorry, the Twyford Station comment about the parking. I guess there is a land use planning question there, which I think we could have further conversations about, but I'm fairly sure we don't want to be expanding parking, by a huge amount, if you know what I mean. But don't know if anyone's got a particular comment on that. It's back really. Increase in parking.
Yeah, no, I would have to take that away. As you said, there is. I'm not used to that. Apologies. Yeah, no, probably. I think we've looked at options for the station in the past. Those are still on the table, and we can certainly revisit them as part of this strategy moving forward.
Peter, you had some more questions.
Okay. Page 42, school streets. I fully support that. Again, I think this is more about I think you mentioned it anyway, coming back to this scrutiny meeting to talk about your school's plan. Because I think one of the major complaints I have is about the school run. And if we could get rid of that, and you do say further down the document that 100% of pupils are within a 15-minute cycle to schools. So we really need to be exploring that.
Yep. So we are doing some feasibility at the moment. We've looked at a few schools and basically whittled them down in terms of what's most appropriate for an initial kind of school streets, especially as a pilot. We want something that's going to be relatively straightforward, but still has quite a big impact. So we'll be bringing those, bring it to scrutiny. It's something that could come back fairly soon, hopefully, in terms of where we are in the process and what our plan is. But we would hope to be introducing school streets possibly as early as next September. With the moving traffic offences now being enforceable, we can apply to use cameras instead of manned closures, which is always a bit of a bone of contention, because I think getting volunteers such as parents to try and stop their fellow parents to drive through has always been a bit of an issue, where we've done a bit of benchmarking with West Berkshire and Reading, and they've found similar issues. So with the cameras coming forward, it's definitely something that we think is much more viable and something that we could, or that we do want to do more of, definitely. On top of that, we've obviously got the plan to have a safe routes to school strategy as well, so that'd be sort of a key part of that.
Good. That sounds good. Again, on page 42, I think this is through the whole documents, is whilst we do have a lot of pollution in the centre of Wokingham Town, there's no mention of actually considering about closing Wokingham Town to through traffic. And because I recognise if that were to be done, it would be a very long process, because it's quite a dramatic change. So it would be useful, I think, to start thinking about this within this document.
Yeah, no, I do take that point. I think we have got the reduced impact of traffic movements on roads, and there is an action on Wokingham Town Centre as well, isn't there? Just trying to find it. Traffic and speed limit changes on under access on clean air. What that actually means, we'd have to do a lot more work to be able to determine if we were to do something like closing certain roads or parts of the town centre. It would need a lot more work and a lot more studying before we put it into a strategy document as an action, because I think it could be failing before it starts, kind of thing, before we get to do any decent research into it. But that kind of sentence is where we're going to be doing investigations, I suppose, into that sort of thing, and what other things we could do to reduce traffic in town centres.
Yeah, I think without it actually being documented, it would never happen. So I do feel there should be a point in there saying we need to consider, as part of this strategy, due to clean air, whatever, resident feedback is the closure of the town centre through traffic, with the appropriate consultation, But without it being in this document, it will never happen. So I think I'll quite like to very much like to see that there.
In the same vein, we'd want to consider it in other town centres. So Twyford, for instance, there's a suggestion that you could do the same in Twyford, but you need to provide alternative routes, because both Twyford and Wokingham are A roads. There's no getting away from that. So without getting into the detail in this conversation, it's a difficult conversation to have, and the strategy moving forward will be hard to find one that works without alternative routes. Obviously, for Waken, that really relies very much on the Southern Distributor Road and other infrastructure. So the wording in here needs to be, and I'm not saying we shouldn't capture it, but it needs to be in such a way that doesn't necessarily say that's what we do, but it's part of a town centre management strategy moving forward. I mean, we've got 20-mile-an-hour speeds in town centres, so you do it in small steps, and you get to a closure eventually.
But yeah, most traffic going through the town centre is travelling at 20 miles an hour or below. So I think that's neither here nor there, to be honest. I think, yes, you make the point about the Southern Distribution Road, you make the point about Twyford, but all I'm saying is let's just have the wording in the document, and then the decision of how to do it and whether to do it can be made later. Without it being there, it's never going to be on the table again. Right, one of the things I did notice is and I think you touched it with the Chamber of Commerce not actually mentioning, but we've got big vendors like Sainsbury's, Tesco's, Morrison's, and they should be part of the conversation. So, for example, I say in Winnersh, Sainsbury's yanked out all their bike stuff and then put 4 back, which are all cluttered with trolleys. So we need to have a conversation with those big vendors to enable people to cycle to those places. So again, that's not mentioned in this document. So I think that should be one of the action points, how to engage with the larger supermarkets vendors.
Yeah, sure. I think there is a line there about My Journey doing, I can't remember what it says exactly, doing more or something. But My Journey currently have one business active travel officer who works with all the businesses across the borough. And she would be speaking to each of the supermarkets, as well as going to those, the big Winners Triangles and TVP, those kind of areas. I think there's definitely a case to do more there. And we are trying to find ways of how we might be able to fund that with future non-residential developments, potentially, because obviously My Journey is funded by Section 106. So if we can do something like that, we certainly would do. I think the specific examples you give there are really interesting because they're like local issues that we only find out about after they've happened. So now we know about it, we can go and talk to them. But yeah, I think you're right, getting them on board early on. And as part of this consultation, we'll obviously get our travel officer to spread the word as much as possible and try and get people to feed into the process.
I can just interject there before I ask Charles for his questions. There's a lot of good ideas coming out at the moment that I think they are targeting the consultation. They are good questions to go in the consultation because there are specifics for people in different areas rather than the general sweep of things. General outline from the summary is about targets rather than specific projects, and some of these come down into specific project areas, and I think they could do well if they were put into the consultation as questions. Charles.
Thank you. I'll save my second question because that's one of those basically. But the first one was, there is something in here about the 2 railway stations just outside the borough, Crowthorne and Green Park. I'll talk about Crowthorne because that's the one I understand. There's no bus route currently to Crowthorne at all, where most of a good chunk of the people who use it will come from our borough. And the second issue there basically is one of the station car parks is next to a garage who are parking all their cars on it during the day, so you can't get into it, which is causing people who live in my area to drive into Wokingham instead. So I think it needs something in here about where it's on the boundaries of the borough. Basically, there may be similar issues at Green Park, I don't know, about how it affects transport use, and that we have to have ongoing communication with perhaps Network Rail and neighbouring councils in terms of that.
If I could just mention Green Park. Green Park's really well served by Mere Oak, so the Mere Oak car park and ride will serve that well.
Yeah, so no, I take your point on Crowthorne. We do talk to Bratton Forest regularly at an officer level, and they have been involved in this process. But yeah, it's definitely something that it would be good to improve, and it's something we, again, if we could fund it ourselves, I suppose we try and contribute to getting something down there. I know we have talked about, I can't remember which bus it is that goes through there. Is it Lurford? Yeah, no, we have talked to them about diverting buses and getting things moved around. It's just, especially after COVID, it's just one of those things that's kind of not viable at the moment. But yeah, it's definitely something that's on the radar, and I can't remember every detail of the BSIP, it might well be in there, but yeah, that's a good point. And just, yeah, sorry, and on those railway stations, generally, we work very closely with both Network Rail and the train operator. We obviously don't have a lot of influence over them, but we do try and make improvements where we can.
David?
Yes.
Sure. Question. I've not been looking to the right enough, so if I'm really pleased.
Thank you. Sorry, I was waving my hand discreetly. Yeah, I have to be more put forward. I mean, the thing about high level strategies is that when you get to this point, you could justify almost anything by fitting it into one of these priorities. And that's the tension that always exists with having something overarching, is to make sure it's, still coherent. And that's like part of the problem. But when you make a strategy, you do have to think about priorities as well. And priorities are about choices, about, and what I was interested that there wasn't was something about what we're not going to do. Yeah. What we're going to stop doing. And particularly since this follows on from LTP3 and depressingly would feed then into LTP5. It would be interesting as part of this to think about and to present what was learned from the first one, not looking at sort of individual failures or postmortems and whatever, but to say, okay, what are we going to be doing differently in this? Because I think that would give some clarity to people about the choices that are going to have to be made, and those choices could be presented more clearly. Like, I didn't get a sense here of like what we were not going to be doing. And so there needs to be, because this needs to be, I understand, responsive to changes in government policy, and who knows, changes in government. But it also has to be resilient to stand and say, these are the things that we believe are important for this borough. Yeah, and these are the things that we are going to use every ounce of leverage that we have to make sure that they get done.
Thank you, Marie. David.
I'd like to come back, if I may, to the Southern Distributor Road. And when I moved to Finchampton in 1984, the Southern Bypass was already then being sort of heralded as the solution to all the town centre's problems. And here we are 40 years later. What actually is it? Is it a bypass or is it a distributor road? Because I've heard it described as both simultaneously, including by a council officer last year. If it isn't a bypass, then the conversation we've been having about taking traffic out of Wokingham town centre, and Pete talked about maybe some long-term vision of pedestrianising it, but without the distributor road there to take not just cars but heavy traffic out of the town centre, that idea of becomes a bit of a fantasy if that road isn't equipped to it. And certainly, when you look at William Heeler's Way as the first step of it, it's difficult to imagine sort of trucks and large lorries and buses all vying for position as they try and sort of get past the town. You're only going to get one chance to get this right. And if this is a long-term transport strategy, I can't think of anything much more significant in that than how we get from the far southern edge of the borough towards the M4, for example.
Interestingly, Steve Bailey's on the call and he helped develop the scheme. Southern Distributor Road is a distributor road. That's its foremost role, but it's designed, or should be designed, such that it will accommodate all modes of travel. So it accommodate HGVs as well, to allow for vehicles to have an alternative route around the town centre. So it's a distributor road that provides access for all vehicles. So it will allow HGVs. I will accept that William Heeler's Way does seem to be a bit contradictory to that, as that point of view. And I have a colleague on the call. I don't know if he wants me to draw him in or not, but Steve, there's a lot of discussions around how the developers have helped us deliver the roads, and there's certain things that we've had to do to accommodate both developer and our aspirations. So I think there's been some compromise slightly. But moving forward, we have what we got, and it is a distributor road that will provide an alternative route around the town centre. So the new road that's been designed is much more like what I think you would expect to see. But yes, I accept what you're saying, but it is what it is, and that's the way we've got to move forward on that.
If I can just add to that, when we were looking at these South Woking Distributor Road, one of the major constraints is the Fincham railway bridges, which were relatively low and particularly don't accept high goods vehicles. That was one of the reasons why it's also not necessarily able to function as a bypass around the town centre.
Sorry, David.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of sums up certainly my frustration, and I suspect many others, that here we are talking about the fundamental long-term strategy, and we're saying a road serves two purposes simultaneously, which don't sit in harmony with each other. As we've said, William Healis Way, maybe a distributed road for the houses, is by no stretch of the imagination really a town centre bypass. We've got the problem with the railway bridges that's existed again since I've been here, and nothing in this is actually really tackling either of those issues. I personally find that quite frustrating. I know we haven't got a magic wand, but I think it would be useful to think about or to see some expression within this strategy. I mean, clearly I'm going to solve it tonight, but some expression within here. This is a fundamental area that we need to address and need to think about a process by which we address it.
It's quite a difficult one to answer because the Southern Distributed Road is part of the previous local plan. It's part of the previous LTP3. It's a process that's still ongoing. It doesn't necessarily feature as a new scheme, the one that you put into here. The policies and the processes in here need to support moving forward, but I don't think you can look back and say we need to change something that we'd already done, because the process is already well and truly baked into the planning process. I don't think we're in a position where we can actually influence the change necessary through here, but we can make sure that policies are in here that enable us to support change moving forward. I think that's what the key is. Yeah.
Well, may it be what the plan needs to reflect is the fact there's a problem, which is you're driving by car from the south of the town centre and want to access the M4, or if you're driving a large goods vehicle or a bus, we have a problem. And that's the bit I'd like to see. What the solution is, I accept we can't retrofit and we are where we are and all those wonderful cliches, but it would be great to see that expressed slightly more clearly, perhaps, because it doesn't feel like the magnitude of the problem. I'm sort of looking for Charles' support on this, whether the magnitude of the issue really comes out in the document that we have.
Before I take other questions, just want to bring you back to a point. If you have a look at page 97, 8.2. 97. So this is the WSP's assessment of alternatives, and as they state in there, there are no nothing in the LTP4 is identified as a key strategy alternative. So the assessment was based on the policy alternatives as assessed as we do nothing scenario with LTP3. So everything that comes in that evidence base after that in that particular area is indicating what would happen if we did nothing. We just carried on with the LTP3. And that's something I think we all agree that we can't do, because things have changed since 2011. The area has changed dramatically, and LTP4 is trying to address some of that, not necessarily individual issues, when there are plenty of them we all experience in ourselves travelling around the borough. But as a borough-wide effort, where can we best put the funds that are available to improve things for our residents and for us and for our community? It's there may be lots of things that we think would be instant wins, but at what cost? And looking at some of the items in the plan, and I'm sorry, taking it back a page or two, back to page 42, and looking down the list of generalities that are in here, it's within that general spiel of a list of items of wish list, if you like, almost, but it's a wish list with a meaning. because there are individual areas that are addressed in here and individual processes. And there's good ones in there. I see the general theme in there about, if I think of my own area, for argument's sake, I take my area of Shinfield and 3 Mile Cross, etc. The schools that the children, all kind of the issue we've had this year with school transport, because a number of additional children needed special needs or had rights to travel. Suddenly we've got a large element of the community that have no idea how they're going to get the children to school. And there's themes in here about improving the school transport processes, improving the bus services, the frequency, etc. All of these, a lot of these are zero cost wins because it's about negotiation with partners, about improving bus services and frequency, etc., and even routes. But they are no cost wins to Wokingham Borough Council, but they have a big meaning to the LTP4. So yes, I do appreciate the comments that are coming in, that there are definitely some areas that need more in-depth thought. And maybe that's something that's going to be taken on board, hopefully from the conversation we had. But I think we are generally of the same consensus that leaving it at nothing is not going to be good for us. We've got to make some improvements, and it's not a case in this particular documentation. There's nothing specific in here to say do A, do B, do C. It's about a generalisation of the areas that we need to concentrate in, and that's what the LTP4 is about. So that's where I'd like. If it fits in with what we're talking about, I think that's where this committee should be generally directing ourselves into, because otherwise, one of the things I would turn around and say that to investigate all of the evidence, I would turn around and say this was a consultation that was delivered to the council. Pardon me. The evidence has been in there and been utilised. And if we challenge the evidence, then we challenge everything else that's in here as well, because that means if we turn around and say the evidence is wrong, we're turning around and saying the plan is wrong as well. Pauline.
Thank you, Chairman. If we're on to up to page 123, there's another few questions I've got. I was looking particularly at the sustainability issues and opportunities from page 73 onwards. I think you've got a mistake on.
Sorry, Pauline. Yeah. Can I ask you again? 123 is an appendix title.
Pardon?
123 is an appendix title in my book. I've got this 123.
No, I said 73.
73.
Yeah, page 73. So if we're looking at page 73 onwards, just for your just to help you on page 74, I think you've forgotten to update it with a new 2035 date for the government's end of sale of traditional vehicles. Page 75, you talk about tourist attractions. I'm not aware of any tourist attractions in Wokingham Borough, so I'd be interested in you enlightening me on those. And on page 77, it says this is likely to, the population is anticipated to increase 1% a year, blah, 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 blah. This will increase the number of private vehicles on the roads, which contradicts what you say on page 22, section 2.7, where it says the number of vehicles have increased, but the number of people on the roads hasn't as much. So I think there's some referential integrity problem between your data on page 22 and on page 77. That was just a few minor points. And that, give me a second, I'll just find the next one.
We're looking at observations. Anybody else got any observations that they'd like to make about any data? Peter.
It mentions 3 park and rides, one of which is being constructed. It fails to mention the derelict one at Oakingham Bell.
Anybody else?
More. Page 88, point 6.2.3. It talks about habitats and public access to habitat sites. And I just wondered what your view was on access to the Loddon River and the heathland around there. Because we've got, I think, a small nature reserve there, which nobody can get to because it's got no parking and no access and no anything as far as I can see. And indeed, I don't even think you can cycle there. So I just wondered if there was any more thought on 6.2.3 that there are some sort of nature things around here. And I think that's it for me on that. So pretty small points, but just interested in your answers.
But I think, as mentioned earlier, the HRA, the full assessment hasn't been done yet. This is still at the early screening stage, so it's definitely something they can take into account. You can bring up, talk to them about that.
I think the others are just corrections. Yeah.
Understood.
Sorry, do we have any tourist attractions that I'm not aware of? I can't think of any. It's in Henley. I wouldn't consider that to be a tourist attraction, but okay. Fair point.
Yeah.
I guess it depends on how you define a tourist attraction, but you could define it as a place of destination, which, you know, we've got a couple, and one of them is particularly the Dinton Pastures area. So you could argue there is, maybe the word tourist might be not quite the right definition, but we can certainly review that.
Yeah.
Finally, to come back on schools, we had a bit of a conversation earlier twice on schools. I think one thing to bear in mind and to remember is that schools are not necessarily local to the pupils. So we've got schools all over the place, but one of the issues with schools is that most of the pupils that go to the schools don't live near them because there's other people going to the schools that are essentially pushing them out. So if you look in Early, you've got people travelling past Maiden Early School to go to Bullmush. There's something very similar happening in Finchhamstead with Bowhunt. There's all sorts of problems with catchment. So one of the things I don't think this highlights necessarily enough is that actually, if we want to do something about home to school transport, we need to do something about catchment. So we need to do something about the locations and number of schools, not just the roads.
Paul, I did see your hand up. Was that Legacy or? Yeah, you're on mute.
Sorry, it was going to be a comment on what Pauline had said about Henley. Just a reminder, the south side of the river, Remingham, which is where the regatta is actually held, or most of it is held, is actually inside Wokingham Borough, although it's all called Henley for the Henley Regatta. And there's more than just that event takes place during the year as well.
Thank you, Paul. I think my question was, I don't think that's really a tourist attraction, but I'll take other people's views on that. I was thinking more of Windsor Castle and such like.
Alistair, was yourself? Thanks.
Well, how about the Woodley Air Museum? Yeah, I was just going to just make comment. Well, Pete's comment about cycle racks at Sainsbury's. I mean, it's worth mentioning that Wokingham Borough's own sports facilities like Laurel Park, Chalfont Park haven't got a single cycle rack. So, you know, we could be starting at home on that. Yeah, the thing it is about, shouldn't there be some more aspirations in here, if, you know, even if they're not very achievable? I mean, so the point about the bridges, the railway bridges, we may never get them widened, but shouldn't that be an aspiration in the plan, just in case by miracle money did come available to make the bridges wider? Shouldn't we be incorporating you know, what bigger aspirations? Doesn't mean they're going to happen.
Yes, thank you, Alistair. No, I take your point. I mean, the widening of the bridges and the lowering of the road deck to accommodate higher vehicles is something that we're actually working on currently. So it's not an aspiration, it is already something we're trying desperately to do. Funding is obviously a big issue, but it is on the cards already. So we can put it in this document as a work in progress, I guess, and consider it that way. But it is definitely something that's already in the pipeline. So it's already part of the LTP3, it's already part of the local plan. So we can repeat things that were in the local plan before and add them to here. I guess that comes back to the conversation we had earlier about making sure we're looking at what we have done well already and what still needs to be done. And maybe we can draw that out in this document a bit more in that sort of area.
Right, could I just add another couple then? I was looking, I mean, from sort of the point of view of nature, you know, and the hedgehogs or whatever, I mean, there is on page, was it 294? And the evidence, it says something about creating stronger linkages between and around habitats to reduce fragmentation. I mean, I mean, is there a case of sort of, you know, have habitats already been fragmented, and should we be looking to create green corridors, you know, where we just built a motorway and there's, you know, there's massive tarmac gaps? Should these sort of things be, would that be, you know, an aspiration? And the other one I was thinking was, I mean, when they built things like the A329M, I mean, there's a lot of rights of way that were sort of just truncated, you know. Would it be an aspiration to rejoin, say, Dunk Lane in Hurst with Toutley Road in Embrook, you know, to create a quiet route to Tinton pastures from Wokingham? You know, that would be you know, I mean, the people at the time when they built the motorway weren't thinking about these sort of things, and they just chopped these roads off. But I mean, shouldn't it be an aspiration? Perhaps not achievable, but, you know, to put down in writing, say that we would like to see these routes, you know, put back together. You know, Poplar Lane's another one. Hurst to Poplar Lane in Winnersh to Poplar Lane in Hurst. That's another one. I mean, there's these things all along the motorway corridors.
Sorry, I'm just going back, sorry if I can. The comment on the document about creating stronger linkages, that's from the biodiversity strategy. So it's just it's basically summarising that document. But we are working with the biodiversity team because they're looking at a new strategy in terms of how they're going to be increasing biodiversity across the borough. So they'll be obviously feeding into this process as well. So that will be a key part of it. I think in terms of reconnecting those old links, it's something we could make reference to, I think. I would have expected it to be in the rights of way plan as well already, which kind of complements this, kind of sits alongside it. So it'd be worth reviewing that, just seeing whether it is or not. But yeah, no, it's definitely something we're going to look at.
Right. I'm wondering other things to think about. Although I have thought a lot reading this over the weekend and missing out on gardening and housework, which has been really good. Just get my act together. So while I'm thinking, and it won't take me too long, honestly, is there any more questions? Ask Marie first, then Pauline, then
Jeff. Sorry, just to underline the point about consultation again, because we've had several consultations where we've had this kind of, especially from surveys, a pretty woeful response from the 18 to 24. And that particular group, I think we need to think more broadly about, or more specifically rather, about how we're going to engage with them. And there is like local expertise up the road in Reading. Yeah, I mean, the qualitative research units there have done a lot of work and would really like, I'm sure they would chew their own arm off to have a chance to work on some of these things. So to reach those, because we cannot say that we've got a strategy. I mean, as I said, you could fit almost any priority into this, but, we can't say that this has been reflective of the concerns of people if we haven't made a concerted effort to reach, people that we're clearly currently not reaching. And in relation to that, I mean, one of the priorities that I hear an awful lot, which is less emphasized here than I would have expected, to be honest, is noise. Yeah, a lot of people, especially newcomers or people who've moved recently into the borough, talk about the level of noise and how I'm not saying it's the same as living in some parts of London, but I mean, it is experienced as an issue. and it's something that you would hope that a transport plan would address, you know, or at least include some awareness of like how that, I mean, I know there is data on it, but there's just this kind of disheartening sentence about how it's, you know, the noise levels are expected to increase. And, you know, how this leads into how do you engage with people when, you know, their priorities are unlikely to be addressed. I mean, sometimes for good reasons, but that's just one example, because if you ask people, if you did citizens panels, if you did focus groups, if you did kind of door knocking and all these things, you would get a lot about noise, I would predict. And then, you know, what would we do with that?
If there's a,
Yeah, so I was just going to,
please, thank you.
first of all, thanks for the Reading idea. That's worth giving a try. And as I said, we are open to any ideas at all in terms of how we can reach out to those people. I think our comms team, you know, do try, but I guess they, you know, they're still learning as well as they go. And if we can all work together on that, that'd be great. In terms of noise, I was trying to recall where noise is mentioned in here, but it's mainly focusing on the M4, isn't it, in our document? But there is definitely something about kind of lower noise materials and that kind of thing as part of our maintenance processes that we have talked about in the past. Hasn't come through, but that's a really interesting point. And I think you're right, they're the kind of things that we could potentially miss if we don't get through to everybody.
Funnily enough, my question was sort of related to noise as well. The one bit that isn't in here, and I just wondered if that was intentional, was aviation. Is that because it's outside your control and therefore it's not mentioned? It does generate quite a lot of traffic as well as aircraft, but I just wondered if you had any thoughts on why that wasn't in there. Is it just because it's too far away to worry about?
Yes. No, it's a good point though, and we do obviously have our TVP is now being used as a Heathrow park and ride. So there are definitely a lot of people working in the area or living in the area, work at Heathrow. So it's something that we could look at in terms of passengers travelling there rather than as opposed to the actual planes themselves. That's a good point.
The other little plea was page 237. You can't read the key on the graph. So I don't know what on earth those blots mean, but it'd be useful if you could. Or at least you can't on my copy. Waste management facilities. It's got a lot of nice coloured dots, but you can't read the writing that goes with them.
If I can make a comment about that as well, on the PDFs, they don't zoom out too well either. So they are a bit blurred in the original.
Thank you. I had suggestions on the draft consultation questions on page 401. Are we ready to move to that section?
Can I just pause before we get there, because it is something I think we'll all give attention to. I just got a couple of comments, if I may. Noise. Here's a good bit of news then about noise. Is Shinfield Studios. All the residents that live around Shinfield Studios have all said how quiet it is now that they've got the barrier of the buildings in the way. So all the lots of complaints that we had from Shinfield about what they were going to experience has actually died away. And actually they said there's a benefit for them. So that's one item. Pollution particulates. Where I live, quite close to Junction 11, National Health, turn around and say it's a very high risk of particulate pollution. And sorry, not the CO, carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide pollutants, they say very low. So I find puzzling when we consider about the traffic, but it is about the particulates that will never go away when we go to EV. We're still going to have tyre wear, we're still going to have dust from brakes, etc., and it's still going to be there. They're still going to churn up the dust on the roads. So that's still going to be there, and it's going to be a difficult thing for us to mitigate with when so many developments are quite close to the motorways. Aviation, an item I'd be quite happy to see come to fruition at some time is the West Heathrow rail link. So another spur from Elizabeth line going directly into Heathrow would add the commercial
aspect or the relevance of living in this area to a lot of people that want to do that at the international, especially as well with, again, Shinfield Studios. Now that the strike's off, they're looking forward to early next year to start delivering on their projects. So there will be an influx, an increase. Aviation, the other side of that for the noise is when and if eventually the new runway gets put in place, then we have no idea what that's going to do to our aviation noise above Wokingham area. So if we feel that we have done the justice to the summaries and the initial sides, then I think, yes, it is a good time to move on to the consultation and the questions that are going to be placed in front of the community, and to see if we've got any suggestions to enhance that if it's needed. So, Laura, I think you had the first question on this. And if you could quote the page you want to refer to.
It's 401. So it's the draft consultation questions. So beginning on the About You section, I think it would be beneficial to have something about household income to make sure it's not just people with a healthy income feeding back on this, because we know that people of low income use transport differently. And also the question of why were those four chosen? Why was gender chosen and not ethnicity? That's just a rhetorical question, so you can go away and think about it, because residents may ask. But I do think household income would be good, especially for the anti-poverty team who are data nerds, and I think we'd find that very useful to know that our transport policies go in the right direction for people with lower incomes. Question 5, do you believe the local transport plan should be updated? I think it's a question of, if lots of people say no, does that really change anything? Surely we're going to go ahead with this anyway. I don't know, but is that really a necessary question? Question 6, which of the 3 themes do you believe are most important? Those 3 themes, they're just on the environmental one. It doesn't have anything about the growing economy or the healthy, safe places. And I just wondered why those 3 are focused on and not the other 3 in the other 2 sections too. So we'll probably want to include those. And then going on to the questions, I think just need a bit more wordsmithing to make it clearer that it's talking about sections rather than statements. I think we need to think quite clearly about plain English, because not everyone will understand a lot of the jargon of what a high quality travel corridor is. So we need to just be clear on that. And then at the end where it says, can you identify your top 3 priorities, 9 themes listed, it would be great to have grids there as well, like we've had previously earlier up, just so people don't forget what they've read, and it's easier to decipher when they tick certain ones as important. Yes, with question 16, are there any measures you particularly support? Instead of leaving it blank, having that as a grid would be important. So those were things which just popped up to me really as initial thoughts.
Thanks. Before everyone else jumps in, can I just quickly apologise? You're absolutely right. Number 6 is supposed to be the 3 key themes, and there was a mistake that I thought we'd rectified. This must be an old version. So it does say each of the 3 key themes, not just the environmental ones in the main document. And just in terms of the About You, they're kind of placeholders for the standard Wokingham questions, which we always get in questionnaires. If we can add in the it was the income, wasn't it?
The household income data.
Yeah, household income. I think we can ask, can't we? But yeah, a lot of people might choose not to respond. But
that's fine.
At least yeah, no, I think we're okay to ask that. We obviously comms will tell us, but thanks. Yeah.
Hey, so I've got an observation to make about the questions and the demographics that we're trying to get to respond. The fact that we have this statement that there's this big gap between 24 and 65 and not responding, and virtually nobody underneath. I'd like to see, if it's possible, something to involve the schools, because at the end of the day, this is a long-term plan. There are a lot of school children that are going to come to point at some stage where this is going to make a difference to them at that younger age, when they're starting to want to work, etc., their travel options and things like this. So I'd like to see if it's possible to involve a questionnaire that not only does it go to the children or via the schools and involve them, but by being with them, it also goes into the household and includes their parents, who seem to be in the demographic area of the age group that do not take part. So I'd like to see if we can increase the audience with a view to using the schools as an outlet for the questionnaires. But that then throws a question in, would this questionnaire style work for them? And if we do want it to go to the parents, there's got to be an element of this in there, but there's got to be something in there that we can say about the children. What's their experience, for argument's sake, of school travel? Because that's going to affect bus statements and things like that we're going to make. If that can be taken on board, appreciate that. Thanks.
Yep. Yeah, sure. So the My Journey team work with schools, frequently. They get into some schools more than others, obviously, so it's quite difficult to get into a large number, especially in the timescales we've got. But it's definitely something we could take on board. We are, although it's laid out like this, it would obviously be through Wokinham's Engage platform. So there are certain things it can and can't do. So I think the grid that Laura mentioned is definitely something that could be achieved, but anything a little bit more technical than that, or even trying to make it fun for children, probably Engage might not let us. But we have Engage are now allowing people from 13 upwards to enter data. That was a recent change. It was 16, but apparently that was a European law.
Yeah.
And because obviously we can now go down to 13. So does mean that those people can actually fill it in themselves. But we could look at working with My Journey, doing a school or children specific survey or something like that could feed in separately. It's just how we make sure that data aligns, I suppose. Is the
finding the right people to work on it. Looking for volunteers, but I want to treat your hand for that. No, so thank you for that. Pauline.
Sort of connected to your point, Chris. I agree with you. I just worry about the language in this is a little bit technical and a little not very accessible. I think you probably should have a bit of the plain English society have a good run over it, because to be honest, I don't think a lot of people would understand what on earth you're talking about with protect and enhance strategic connectivity or whatever. I think it needs a bit of try and name it a 10-year-old rather than somebody with a PhD in road transport, I think.
I was wondering really what the high level aim of this questionnaire was, bearing in mind we've got a weighty document someone's going to have to read in order to answer the questionnaire sensibly. So how is it supposed to hang together, and what are you trying to get out of it?
So I guess effectively you're asking people what they think of each of the sections, because we have broke it down in that way. But what we really want to know is whether people support certain areas specifically, and if there's anything in there particularly that they don't like, that they don't think we should be doing. So that's kind of our main aims. I think it's the common problem, isn't it, with surveys? Having too many free text boxes potentially makes it very hard to analyse at the end. But it is something that we might have to consider, as just we've already got a free text after each section, which could be filled with a lot of information. But I think you're right, maybe we do need to go and refocus on exactly what we want out of it and see if we can work towards that goal. That's pretty good.
Yeah, sorry, because one of the problems I have, I think it goes back to the clear English and so forth, is the accessibility of it. If I'm going to be faced with, I've got to trawl through a 350-page document and answer this survey, I'm not going to do it.
No, that's right. So when it is out as a consultation document, we're just asking people to look at the action plan and the front page, the main document of the report. Anyone who takes a special interest into why we've said certain things and where our sort of information's come from, they can go and look online, which will obviously provide links to all those background documents so they can see where our thinking has come from, I suppose. But yeah, the idea is to try and keep it the front end simple and concise, and having hopefully a glossier version with more pictures and that kind of thing would help with that as well. So we'll be doing that as part of the consultation material.
Just take you in order. So it's Charles next, please.
Thank you. Very simple one, actually. I note what you said about the About You. We'll have the council standard thing on there. Does that include location, where the person is, which town, which parish, which area? Because I think that's important for this.
It does include postcode, but I've got a feeling they don't, I'm not sure if they actually record it because you have to log in to use the system. So you do get the postcode, but I think because of the Data Protection Act, I'm not sure if they actually use it in the analysis or not, but we can ask again separately as to postcodes.
I don't think that's necessary. I think as long as you know basically which areas of the borough are responding to this and which are not, I think that's all that matters.
Yeah, sure.
I think if I can make a comment on the map you've got where you've broken the area, broken them down into the 4 areas, just ask them which area do you live in, because that's where your policies, your plans for the LTP are being affected by those areas that they live in. David.
Yeah, just supporting some of the comments was said. I mean, to me, it would be useful to have a really clear statement of purpose behind this, because if it's, I'm not being cynical, but if it's, we are obliged to commit a consultation, therefore we'll have a consultation, tick box, move on. That's fine. Let's be honest about that's what it is. But like everybody has said, this is pretty inaccessible in terms of language to me. And if we fill it in, even if the language improvements, we get 750 responses out of 175,000 residents. As I've said before, I don't know what that tells us about anything, to be honest, other than 750 people have got an unusually high interest in highways. So I think some sort of statement of purpose about, are we really trying to draw out from people what their needs are? Or is it something else? I don't know, but there's something to me that says I'm not sure what you're going to get, what value this information is going to be when you get it. And again, I think certainly, as everyone said, when you decided that, having probably non-highways people helping you put the wording together, maybe a benefit. That, I mean, I think it would be useful to have some sort of benchmark for saying actually what level of response would we like? I know we'd like everyone to respond, but are we after 1,000, 2,000, 5,000? Because that again, I think informs how you go about this, how we promote it, how we seek responses.
Before we dive into the book to find it, whenabouts would the consultation be put to the public?
So the plan would be, obviously it's going to executive in November. So we're looking at a consultation December going throughout Christmas and throughout January. So we're adding an extra couple of weeks to take account of the fact that we're going through Christmas, which might actually increase the uptake because people want. But yeah, so we were going for 8 weeks through.
So I think you've got long enough to be able to work on the consultation to bring it forward and take in the other ideas as well to try and increase the audience, and then we'll see what the results are. It's a good opportunity to get it going this time and see if we can get it right for future. Thank you.
Yep, no, definitely. I definitely appreciate all the feedback, guys.
Al, then Laura.
Yes, doesn't the council have, isn't it called the 3 C's method for writing clear English for the general public? Is that right? So, and I would have thought, if you just ask people where they live, they'll put Early or Woodley or Finchampstead. Everyone knows where you don't have to go down to postcode level, do you? There's a
Laura.
Thank you. Just a couple of things. So I did think perhaps on consultation, asking a question of, is there anything missing there? Because you might get some good ideas from residents there. And then also when the action plan is presented in the consultation, obviously everything is quite succinct at the moment, and just making sure that those which might be misinterpreted or be contentious is just explained. So you said on the 20 mph speed limits in town centres that that's not going to be a blanket policy. I think it's just making sure there's enough description in there to not spook people into putting a particular answer which may not be reflective of your plans. And then just being very specific in the wording. So the top one is targeted infrastructure and speed limit changes to improve road safety. I assume you need reductions, but I'm not entirely sure. So it's just being specific as to what the actual plans are.
Sorry, anything else on the floor? Okay, so we take ourselves back to page 9 and what we're actually looking to recommend. That the executive agrees to publish a draft local transport plan for public consultation with the intention and subject to the approval of full council for the council to adopt a plan in summer 2024 as a council strategic plan for transport over the next 10 to 15 years. So this is a long-term view. It does require the consultation, and it still requires
other review after that consultation. That's all documented in here. So this is purely about asking the executive to agree to publish the draft local transport plan for public consultation. That's the primary target of this meeting, is whether or not we feel that this draft plan does that with the observations that we've made during the meeting about questionnaires, etc. And pardon me, because a lot's gone on and a lot's been said, it's going to be very difficult for us to formulate a statement now. I'd like to see the minutes of the meeting come forward, and I'm going to propose to yourselves that I take this forward myself to the executive and present the committee's responses, rather than it just being a written statement we accept. If you're good, can I have a vote on that, please? That's to take this to the executive personally with our recommendations. Thank you. Peter?
Sorry, I just wanted to query on what would be said to the executive. I just wanted some clarity on that.
So I would like to bring it back with the minutes so we can have a clearer view, because there is a lot being taken on board at the moment, and it is quite difficult to put that into words, I think, to say what our feelings are, because they are quite mixed. But there is a general thread that in the group. But I'd like to bring that back to you, and then we have another conversation about that. But I'd like to do that. It doesn't have to be a meeting, it'll be an online conversation. And we'll arrange something quite shortly, as soon as I can get the minutes in front of me. And I don't want to press the Democratic Services to be quick about it. But if we can get something quite early, I'd like to say by Monday next week, we'd have a statement between ourselves that we want to take to executive. I think the next executive meeting is 26th. I'm not sure, but I think that will meet that, and that'll fit in with the plans that the others have got. So if you're in agreement with that, that's the recommendation. Thank you. So I would like to offer the committee's thanks for you staying here, although you wanted to run away. I can appreciate it. You weren't grilled too badly, and thank you, Paul, for staying up as well, considering your health. And we will proceed. Thank you very much.